Canada is ready to take a leadership role in building a coalition of like-minded countries who share our values.
And is a tax on Americans. That's exactly what's going to happen.
August 2025. Along the world's longest undefended border, a fragile peace over a century in the making is about to be shattered. This frontier, stretching nearly 9,000 kilometers, has long been more than just a line on a map. It is a symbol of unprecedented integration, a conduit for nearly $3 billion in daily trade, and the backbone of a continental economy. For generations, it has been a testament to cooperation. Tonight, it becomes a front line. In Washington and Ottawa, two leaders driven by radically different ideologies have set their nations on a collision course. The first shots have already been fired, not with missiles, but with tariffs. What began as a political threat posted on social media has metastasized overnight into the most aggressive trade war in North American history, threatening to unleash an economic shockwave that could cripple industries, decimate supply chains, and redefine the balance of power on the continent. The era of quiet diplomacy is over. The economic war has begun. Breaking this month, an explosive escalation in the simmering trade dispute between the United States and Canada has caught global markets entirely by surprise. America's northern neighbor, long considered its most steadfast and predictable ally, has retaliated against Washington in a manner few thought possible. The initial move came from the White House, a digital proclamation from President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that was vintage in its bravado. The post warned of a sweeping 35% customs duty, a tariff wall designed to project unshakable strength and bring Ottawa to heel. The era of Canada taking advantage of the U.S. is over, Trump wrote, framing his threat as a necessary defense of American jobs against unfairly traded Canadian metals and automobiles. It was a classic Trump maneuver intended to dominate the news cycle and force a capitulation. But this time the response was not what Washington expected. Instead of buckling, Canada punched back, harder and faster than anyone had anticipated. Within hours, the Canadian government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, didn't just match the aggression, it escalated it. In a move that sent tremors through Wall Street and corporate boardrooms, Ottawa announced staggering counter-tariffs valued at $12 billion, targeting a meticulously curated list of American imports. It was a declaration that Canada would not be intimidated. As Carney addressed a galvanized parliament, his words were broadcast live, resonating with a mix of defiance and resolve. If Washington chooses tariffs, then Canada will defend its workers and its industries with equal resolve from the unjust U.S. tariffs, he stated to thunderous applause. His demeanor, calm and analytical, belied the economic fury of his actions. Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, is a figure respected in global financial circles for his steady hand during crises 2, 3, 4. That reputation gave his counter-offensive a chilling credibility. This was not political theater. It was calculated economic warfare waged by a master of the game. The initial shockwave hit the foundational pillars of North American industry, steel and aluminum. Canada didn't just counter tariff. It declared a 50% penalty on these critical metals, instantly adding billions in costs for American exporters and triggering chaos in a deeply integrated supply chain. The reaction was immediate and visceral. "We woke up to find our contracts with Toronto partners effectively void," complained Jack Morrison, the fictional CEO of an Ohio-based aluminum supplier. "A 50% penalty wipes out our profit margin overnight. We're staring into an abyss." His sentiment was echoed across the industrial heartland, where 90% of the steel and half of the aluminum used in American manufacturing originates from its northern neighbor. The very sinews of American industry, from automotive plants in Detroit to aerospace facilities in Seattle, run through Canadian mills and smelters. The timing of this economic broadside could not have been more perilous for the United States. The nation was already grappling with stubbornly high inflation, recorded at 6.2% year over year, a figure that has left American households struggling to afford essentials long before this new crisis erupted. The cost of groceries, fuel, and housing has been a persistent source of anxiety, and now this trade war acts as a massive accelerant. In a rare break from party lines, Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown voiced the fears of many. "This is not just a trade dispute," he warned, his voice grave. "It is a tax on families." He articulated a stark reality. Every dollar added by these tariffs would be felt at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and in car payments, turning a geopolitical battle into a direct assault on the wallets of ordinary Americans. The question now hanging over a continent holding its breath is no longer if there will be economic pain, but how much and who will blink first in this high-stakes war of attrition. Part 2. The economic shock was not a distant tremor, it was a direct hit, a seismic event that ruptured the foundations of North American commerce in a matter of hours. In corporate headquarters across the United States, the announcement from Ottawa was met with a mixture of disbelief and panic. The 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum were not just a negotiating tactic, they were a declaration of economic siege. The intricate just-in-time supply chains that had been the bedrock of continental prosperity for 3 decades suddenly transformed into liabilities. For years, American industry had been built on the seamless flow of raw materials from Canada, a torrent of steel for the skeletons of skyscrapers, aluminum for the skins of aircraft, and specialized alloys for the heart of the automotive sector. This system, a marvel of efficiency, was predicated on trust and open borders. Now, overnight, it had been weaponized. The dependency that was once a source of strength had become an exposed vulnerability, and Ottawa was pressing down with surgical precision. Washington had thrown a punch, expecting a flinch. Instead, Canada had severed a vital artery. The first casualties were not in the corridors of power, but on the factory floors and in the consumer aisles. The price of critical industrial inputs began to surge with a velocity that defied market precedent. Aluminum sheet, the ubiquitous material used for everything from beverage cans to automotive panels, jumped to over $3,500 per ton, a peak not seen since the chaotic post-pandemic recovery of 2022. The American Beverage Association, a powerful lobby representing giants like Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, issued an urgent warning. The cost of their primary packaging material was spiraling out of control. We were in the final stages of planning summer promotions on soda and beer, but those are now indefinitely on hold, a senior Coca-Cola executive stated grimly, speaking on the condition of anonymity. You cannot absorb a cost increase of this magnitude. Consumers will see higher prices within weeks, not months. This was the trade war made tangible. The price of a six-pack, a seemingly simple purchase, now directly tied to a high-stakes geopolitical showdown. The inflationary fire, already smoldering across the nation, had just been doused in gasoline. Nowhere was the impact more devastating than in the heart of American manufacturing, the auto industry. The iconic Ford F-Series pickup truck, for decades the best-selling vehicle in America and a potent symbol of the nation's economic vitality, was directly in the crosshairs. Ford Motor Company, in a stark internal memo that was quickly leaked to the press, estimated that the Canadian tariffs on steel and aluminum would add up to $800 to the production cost of every single truck. In a segment where competition is ferocious and profit margins are already razor-thin, this was a catastrophic blow. It presented an impossible choice: absorb the costs and watch profitability evaporate, or pass them on to consumers and risk a collapse in demand. This dilemma extended beyond Ford, hitting General Motors and Stellantis with equal force and rippling outwards to the vast network of smaller suppliers and parts manufacturers who form the backbone of the Midwest's economy. The tariffs were not just a tax on materials. They were a direct assault on the American automotive ecosystem, an industry that employs millions and is deeply intertwined with the nation's cultural identity. Canada's move, however, carried a strategic message that went far beyond mere retaliation. It was a brutal reminder of a fundamental economic reality that Washington had seemingly forgotten. The United States is not a self-sufficient island. It is a continental manufacturing powerhouse whose foundations are built, quite literally, with Canadian materials. An astonishing 90% of the steel and half of the aluminum used in American manufacturing originates north of the border. At the same time, Canada is the single largest export market for American steel, consuming 1/5 of its output. By erecting a tariff wall, Ottawa was not just blocking imports, it was holding up a mirror to Washington, reflecting its own deep-seated dependence. The message was unambiguous. You cannot punish us without inflicting even greater punishment upon yourselves. To reinforce this position and add a new, sophisticated layer to the conflict, Prime Minister Carney introduced a groundbreaking and audacious requirement. Every ton of steel imported into or exported from Canada must now carry a digital carbon passport, meticulously tracking its emissions profile from the mine to the furnace. This maneuver was nothing short of a geopolitical masterstroke. It reframed the trade dispute from a simple tariff squabble into a battle over the future of green industry. Canadian steel is among the cleanest in the world thanks to our hydroelectric advantage, announced François Laflamme, head of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, seizing the narrative. If the United States wants to maintain its claim to leadership in the green industrial revolution, it cannot ignore the carbon footprint of its supply chain. This move put Washington in an impossible bind. It could either pay the high tariffs or seek alternative sources of steel that were almost certain to be dirtier, thereby undermining its own climate change agenda. To cushion its own producers from the fallout, Ottawa simultaneously unveiled a $1.5 billion emergency support package for smelters in Quebec, a region rich in hydroelectric power. While welcomed by workers, industry leaders immediately warned it was insufficient. The Canadian Aluminum Association reported that credit requests for plant expansions, needed to meet domestic demand, had already overwhelmed the available funding. "We are under severe strain," said Association President Jean-Paul Richard. "If U.S. tariffs remain at 50%, some facilities could face critical cash shortages by winter." Yet a defiant Carney repeated his mantra in a tense press conference, his gaze fixed. "We will not back down." The markets shuddered in response. The Toronto Stock Exchange's metals index plunged 4% in a single day, while shares of American automakers slid as an analyst began slashing earnings forecasts. The opening shots had been fired, and the economic battlefield was already littered with casualties. Part 3. The fallout from Ottawa's counteroffensive was no longer a theoretical exercise for economists. It had become a clear and present danger to America's most critical long-term industrial strategy. In Washington, the very officials tasked with securing the nation's economic future watched in horror as the tariff war began to cannibalize their own agenda. "We are in uncharted territory," warned Jennifer Granholm, the U.S. Secretary of Energy, her statement a stark admission of a policy spiraling out of control. "These tariffs are jeopardizing our entire electric vehicle strategy at the very moment we are trying to accelerate adoption." Her words cut through the political noise, revealing a devastating irony. In the global race to dominate the green economy, a race the White House has framed as a national security imperative against competitors like China, the administration had just kneecapped its own team. The critical minerals, the processed aluminum for lightweight frames, the specialized steel for electric motors, much of it flows south from Canada. By alienating its most reliable supplier, Washington had inadvertently thrown a lifeline to its greatest rivals, creating a strategic own goal of historic proportions. The war for the future of the automobile was being fought and lost, not in Shanghai or Stuttgart, but in a self-inflicted conflict along the 49th parallel. On the ground, the consequences of this high-level brinkmanship were immediate and deeply personal. In the sprawling factory complexes around Detroit, a palpable sense of dread began to permeate the assembly lines. For generations, these plants have been the heart of a cross-border ecosystem, with parts and vehicles crisscrossing the Ambassador Bridge in a seamless, constant dance. Now, that dance had ground to a halt. "Overtime shifts were the first to go," said David Ruiz, a line worker at a Ford facility, his voice etched with the anxiety spreading through his community. We built our livelihoods on that cross-border supply. It was predictable. It was stable. Now it feels like the rules of the game changed overnight, and we're the ones who are going to lose. His story is not unique. It is the story of thousands of American workers whose financial stability depends on a supply chain they never had to think about until it was suddenly weaponized against them. The very tariffs meant to protect them were now threatening their paychecks, sowing confusion and fear in the industrial heartland that was supposed to be the primary beneficiary of this new protectionist era. Across the border, the pain was just as acute, but its nature was different. In Montreal, Sarah Dupuis, the owner of a small craft beverage company, found herself trapped in an economic vice. The price of aluminum cans has surged 27% in just 3 months, she explained, her frustration boiling over. Her business, a dream built on local ingredients and loyal customers, was now at the mercy of global commodity markets thrown into chaos. What am I supposed to do? Do I raise my prices and risk losing the customers who have supported me for years? Or do I cut production, absorb the loss, and risk having to lay off the very people who helped me build this company? Her question echoed through the corridors of countless small and medium-sized enterprises on both sides of the border. These businesses, the lifeblood of the North American economy, lack the vast cash reserves and diversified supply chains of multinational corporations. They cannot easily absorb such a violent price shock. For them, this is not a geopolitical chess match. It is an existential crisis. They are the frontline soldiers in a war they did not choose, caught in the crossfire of decisions made in capitals hundreds of miles away. As the economic casualties mounted, the political pressure began to build with ferocious intensity. In Washington, the United Front began to crack. Lawmakers from industrial and agricultural states, facing re-election in a matter of months, grew increasingly alarmed. They feared that an election-year tariff war would alienate the very suburban and working-class voters whose wallets were being squeezed. The president is gambling with people's wallets, and that is a reckless bet, declared Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, a state whose economy is deeply intertwined with Canada's. We should be at the negotiating table, not escalating a conflict with our closest ally. Her sentiment was quietly echoed in the halls of Congress, where the political calculus was becoming brutally clear. Promises of industrial revival mean little to a voter staring at a grocery bill that has jumped by 20%. In Ottawa, the political dynamic was inverted. Prime Minister Carney's hardline stance, while questioned by some opposition leaders as potentially reckless, was met with overwhelming public support. Polls showed a Canadian populace rallying behind the flag, proud to see their government standing firm against what they perceived as American bullying. Carney had successfully framed the conflict not as a trade dispute, but as a defense of national sovereignty, tapping into a deep well of Canadian identity and transforming economic pain into a source of national pride. This growing divide set the stage for a dangerous escalation. Economists warned that the standoff was rapidly moving beyond a temporary skirmish. If new negotiations failed to materialize, tariffs could climb as high as 70% by early fall, a level that would effectively freeze North American trade in key sectors. The Bank of Canada, in a chilling forecast, projected that such a scenario could shave a staggering 0.88 percentage points off the continent's GDP within 6 months, an economic body blow that would translate into tens of billions of dollars in lost output and hundreds of thousands of jobs. This is not just about steel or aluminum, stated Doug Porter, chief economist at BMO Financial Group, his analysis capturing the gravity of the moment. It is about the credibility of trade relationships that were built over decades. It's about the trust that underpins our entire economic model. If that collapses, the economic fallout will be severe and long-lasting. As of tonight, investors, business owners, and workers are holding their breath. North America's integrated economy, once hailed as a model of cross-border cooperation, is now teetering under the immense weight of political brinkmanship, threatening to pull everyone down with it. Part 4. In the brutal calculus of economic warfare, there is always a moment when the abstract threats of politicians become the cold, hard numbers on a trading screen. For the North American trade war, that moment arrived, with terrifying clarity, on August 21, 2025. What had started as a steel and aluminum tariff skirmish, a political chess match, has now metastasized into a full-scale economic war, with Canada deploying its most powerful weapons yet. On that day, the Midwest Aluminum Premium, a critical benchmark that measures the cost of getting physical aluminum to factories, the real-world price paid by industry, did not just rise, it detonated. The premium surged an unprecedented 54% in a single trading session, closing at $1,270 per pound. This wasn't a market fluctuation. It was a market failure, a fever chart of pure, unadulterated panic ripping through the commodity exchanges. This number, obscure to the average person, is the heartbeat of the American industrial economy, and its violent arrhythmia signaled a massive coronary event was underway. The world's leading commodity analysts at Wood Mackenzie scrambled to process the data, their models struggling to compute a shock of this magnitude. Their initial assessment, rushed out to shell-shocked clients, was dire. They warned that if the full 50% Canadian duty is carried through the supply chain, an additional $70 per pound could be added to the final delivered price. One senior analyst, in a note that flashed across trading terminals from New York to Chicago, abandoned sterile economic language, calling it an inflationary shockwave not seen in decades. This was the sound of the dam breaking. The carefully constructed systems of pricing, hedging, and forecasting that allow modern commerce to function had been rendered useless overnight. Businesses could no longer predict their costs for the next quarter, let alone the next week. The weaponization of the supply chain had created the most dangerous of economic conditions, absolute uncertainty. And in this new environment of chaos, the first victims were already beginning to appear not in heavy industry, but in the most mundane and essential of sectors. The opening front of this new, more intense phase of the trade war was found in the grocery aisle. Aluminum foil, that seemingly simple product, indispensable for food storage, preparation, and pharmaceuticals, became ground zero. Its price volatility sent shudders through the entire food processing and packaging industry, but the most visible impact was on the beverage can. In Montreal, Marc LeBlanc, the beverage producer, whose small business was his life's work, saw his reality upended. "The price of cans has jumped 27% in just 3 months," he stated, his voice a mixture of anger and despair. Now even the cost of bottled water in aluminum bottles is changing. Small businesses like mine were caught. We either raise our prices and betray our customers' trust, or we shut down and send our employees home. There's no third option. His frustration echoes with a haunting resonance across thousands of Canadian and American factories, where overnight cost hikes are forcing companies to make agonizing decisions about layoffs and closures. The trade war had ceased to be a headline. It had become a pink slip. But the role of aluminum extends far beyond the humble soda can. It is a strategic metal, critical to the high-tech, high-value industries that define a modern economy. In the aerospace sector, where every gram of weight is meticulously calculated and component costs are astronomical, the impact was immediate. Airbus Canada, a cornerstone of the nation's advanced manufacturing sector, confirmed that its cost for essential fuselage components, milled from high-grade aluminum alloys, were up by double digits since July. Multi-billion-dollar aircraft orders, with margins calculated to the decimal point, were suddenly facing massive cost overruns. In Vancouver, on the other side of the industrial spectrum, bicycle manufacturers, a symbol of the green, modern economy, reported wholesale cancellations of their U.S. orders. Their lightweight aluminum frames, once a key selling point, had become a crippling liability. As one manufacturer lamented, "Our American distributors told us, 'We love your bikes, but the tariff just made them more expensive than a motorcycle.'" The chain reaction was rippling through every conceivable sector, from supermarket shelves to aircraft assembly lines, proving the central thesis of integrated economies. You cannot break one link without compromising the entire chain. As TD Bank chief economist Beata Caranci observed, when the backbone of modern industry is targeted, every single link in that chain feels the pressure. The pressure was now becoming unbearable, and its epicenter was moving towards the one industry that symbolizes American economic might above all others. Part 5. The shockwave. Having ripped through the commodity markets and consumer goods, it was now closing in on its ultimate target, Detroit. Long the symbol of American manufacturing prowess, the heart of its industrial identity, Motor City has now become the epicenter of the trade war's destructive force. This was not an accident of economic ricochet, it was a calculated strike. The Canadian counter-tariffs were not a shotgun blast, but a sniper's bullet, aimed squarely at the most profitable and politically sensitive sector of the U.S. economy. The assault on the American auto industry was designed to inflict maximum pain to create a crisis so profound it would force Washington back to the negotiating table. For in the intricate dance of geopolitics, a nation's most iconic industry is also its most vulnerable pressure point. And in America, nothing is more iconic than the automobile. The numbers coming out of the executive suites at Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis were apocalyptic. Ford, in a blunt and sobering admission, confirmed that the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum now add a staggering $850 in extra cost to every single vehicle, rolling off its assembly lines. This is particularly devastating for its best-selling F-Series pickups, the steel and aluminum embodiment of the American spirit and the financial engine of the entire company. For years, these trucks have generated profits that finance the company's ambitious forays into electric vehicles and future technologies. Now, that engine was sputtering. According to a grim analysis from J.D. Power, automakers will be forced to absorb at least 70% of these new costs just to keep sales from collapsing. Passing the full increase onto consumers is not a viable option. It would cause demand to crater almost overnight, explained Tyson Jominy, Vice President of Data and Analytics at J.D. Power. In a marketplace where consumers are already stretched thin by inflation, brand loyalty has its limits. The true scale of the disaster was quantified by the Anderson Economic Group, a respected Michigan-based consultancy. Their emergency report calculated that the tariffs on autos and parts alone could cost the American economy over $30 billion in the first year. The burden on consumers would be unprecedented. In the hyper-competitive pickup truck segment, prices could soar by as much as $8,000 per vehicle. This isn't just a price hike, it's a barrier to entry for millions of working-class families and small business owners who rely on these vehicles for their livelihoods. An $8,000 premium transforms a necessary tool of the trade into an unattainable luxury. This is the brutal, on-the-ground reality of the tariff war, a direct tax on the American dream levied not by the IRS, but by a geopolitical gambit gone horribly wrong. The policy intended to shield the American worker was now pricing them out of the very products they build. The electric vehicle sector, the celebrated centerpiece of America's green industrial future, is now buckling under the immense pressure. This nascent industry, far more fragile and complex than traditional manufacturing, is uniquely vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. The dream of an American-led EV revolution was built on a foundation of global components, and the tariffs have just dynamited that foundation. Samsung SDI, a key player in the battery ecosystem, confirmed that the imported aluminum-coated anode, foils, and copper separator films, essential for battery production at its massive new plants in Indiana and Michigan, have spiked dramatically in price. These are not bulk materials like steel beams. They are highly specialized high-margin components, for which there are few, if any, alternative suppliers on short notice. At Rivian, the celebrated EV startup, executives privately warned shareholders in an emergency briefing that the escalating supply chain costs are eroding their margins to the point of near zero profitability. The company, which had been a darling of Wall Street, was now in a fight for its very survival. Its ambitious production targets jeopardized by a trade war it had no part in creating. the crisis quickly spilled over into the political arena. In a heated congressional hearing this morning, Michigan Representative Debbie Dingell, a fierce advocate for her state's auto industry, did not mince words. The tariffs that were meant to protect American jobs are instead strangling our automotive future, she stated bluntly, her voice echoing the fury and frustration of her constituents. We are sacrificing our long-term global competitiveness for a short-sighted political fight. Even the White House now finds itself cornered. Its two signature policies, reshoring manufacturing and leading the Green Revolution, now in direct conflict with each other. By imposing tariffs meant to defend U.S. industries, Washington has ironically and catastrophically undercut its own EV strategy, handing a massive advantage to foreign competitors. If a resolution is not found, forecasters predict tariffs could surge as high as 70% by autumn. The Bank of Canada projects such a scenario could erase billions from the North American economy and drag GDP down by 0.88 percentage points within 6 months. The titans of the new auto industry, Tesla, Rivian, and GM's Ultium battery division, have yet to confirm whether they will be forced to raise prices, but all have admitted in regulatory filings that their second quarter earnings will be, in the words of one analyst, as thin as battery foil. The promise of a clean energy future is being consumed by the fires of the present conflict.